Welcome, everyone, to this CoinDesk webinar on blockchain consortia, the future of coopetition. Coopetition being a word that has for a while now been associated with consortia, but perhaps never more than in this blockchain technology revolution that we find ourselves in. And we don't just have any group here today to talk to us a bit about coopetition and consortia. We have the main players at one of the big four, Deloitte, and their entire leadership team around blockchain technology to run us through what is important to consider when building a consortia, what is important to consider when the actual technology is being constructed from the ground up, and what is important to consider when executing on the grand vision of these consortia. So I do want to just begin with a quick intro to our guests today, all from Deloitte. So how about I let you guys just give a 15, 20-second intro to each of you, and you can maybe run through what you do at Deloitte, your title, and what the role you play in this entire scene is. So Linda, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thank you. My name is Linda Pacek, and I am our global and U.S. leader for our Deloitte consulting practice.
And a great friend of our CoinDesk events at Consensus. Linda has been one of our keynote speakers for the past few years, so happy to have you on the webinar as well.
Well, thank you.
Rob, how about you?
Sure, thanks. This is Rob Massey. I am a tax partner based in San Francisco. I look after all things blockchain and digital assets with the tax lens for the global firm.
And another regular at our events in May. How about you, Brian?
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Hansen. I'm an audit partner in San Francisco, and I lead our strategy for blockchain for the audit practice in the U.S.
Great. Not a Consensus speaker yet, but we'll probably be seeing you at some time. And finally, Mike.
And this is Mike Prokop. Thank you again for having me today. I lead our advisory practice for blockchain in the U.S.
Great. Okay, so we got the team. We got the team from Deloitte. So one of the things that you guys are not new to this space. You are one of the first major brand names to get involved in this sector. So the amount of time that you guys have been working at this is not insignificant. I remember reading some pretty interesting stuff from you guys even back in 2014, 2015. And even back in 2015, consortia were beginning to show signs of being an important feature of this ecosystem. So when we think of that, what have you guys learned when it comes to considering these consortia? When you do meet with folks and you are considering them, why should they consider these? Linda, why don't you get us started with this? Why would someone consider one of these consortia?
Sure. So perhaps maybe setting a bit of context, the first of which is we were fascinated by some of the findings of our annual survey that emerged this past year. Of course, the survey is planned as a blind survey. It addresses numerous geographies throughout the world. And we were fascinated to dig deeper into the finding that was 92% of all of those interviewed suggested that they are about to join or are currently a part of a consortium. Now, as we look back at the mechanics and the evolution of blockchain, recognizing that it's a multi-party construct, business to business in many ways, and it can operate either vertically in an industry or horizontally across perhaps a supply chain or multi-party. And so when we looked at this and digging in deeper to this 92% question, we also recognize in doing work in both the enterprise and in the startup community that consortium strategies in general are many times overlooked. And in fact, the strategy and architecting the governance associated with the many-to-many relationships is many times put to the back burner or put late in the process of the organizations coming together. And so when we think of the fundamentals around governance in general, which is an overlay around a consortium model, we go back to the principles of decision types, decision rights, decision makers. But how do you deal with this in a decentralized autonomous organization, which is essentially the membership of a consortium? And so we started to dig deeper into not only 92%, but we also aggregated all of the findings from around the world in which we have operated in building and then supporting consortiums. And we realized that in this design strategy around the future of coopetition, that there's a number of blind spots. Are these consortium strategies that, even if they are being defined, are they taking into consideration, for instance, thinking about risk ahead of time? Are they looking at what the implications around, particularly in the transactions of value, which we so synonymously understand from a blockchain perspective? Is there a construct in the consortium where they're looking at the implications to the financial statements and where the information is either being sourced or its destination? So when we look at the future of coopetition, we are quite confident that one model to approach blockchain is in fact a consortium, and by no means do we want our listeners today to perceive that there is only a consortium model which can be institutionalized for the success of blockchain to occur, particularly in an enterprise. And so with that, we spent the time, along with my colleagues across all the disciplines, to dig deeper into the impact around this decentralized autonomous organization and in the spirit of coopetition, what that means.
So I did hear a hint in the way you described it, that part of it is almost redefining what some of these consortia can do. So maybe using consortia in ways that we haven't thought of yet or really deployed at a much wider scale. But I'm going to get to that soon. I had sort of planned to talk about what's different this time about consortia just after this. But I want to go back before we go down that road, just to ask, just to put it out there and to really be clear for the audience listening, what should an organization consider before it even gets started around, before they even make a call to Deloitte? What do they have to consider? What are the important factors that they need to understand before they get out of the starting gates and start iterating and ideating on what their role in a consortium will look like?
Sure, I'll start, and perhaps my colleagues can weigh in, since it's this different lens that we apply, which is quite important. But if I were to simply look at a few things, even with our research from across the globe, the importance around the criticality around the participants and or the intermediaries that may participate in the consortium. Who are the participants? We call them trust loops. What is the nature of the trust loop of the participants before even setting up this consortium? Are they already a part of an existing trade organization, which is an obvious migration to the newfound structure of a consortium for blockchain? Most importantly, are the objectives clear? And the objectives meaning things like, is the intellectual property and the sharing of intellectual property clear in the blockchain construct? Are the membership in terms of things like onboarding or offboarding clear in the construct in setting this up? So these are a few areas that you would want to consider at the very early stage of bringing this membership together in consortium. Rob or Mike, would you like to opine a little bit further on that?
I guess, Linda, if I may, and Rob, this is Mike Prokop. So, even going a little bit further back in history of some of these consortiums, I found that, and here's that word again. So there was a consensus that was formed between the industry players that participate in these consortia. The consensus can be drawn from industry groups that some of these companies belong to. Many of the round tables that we see, especially in our space, that are conducted within our walls and others, where pain points are found in commonality and agreed upon. that need to be solved, that need to be worked through, because there's been if you will, a traffic jam of commerce in certain cases because of older technology and still using faxes and things like that, where a technology innovation here could be ripe. So that's one of the base levels where we see this consortia come together. And then it almost seems all the things that Linda so expertly listed, the IP and all of the different things that go around that, almost seem easy at that point. It's getting the leadership buy-in from each person, each company, and then going forward with that plan. Rob, would you like to comment?
Yeah, no, definitely. And with the tax lens, I think there's a lot of considerations in the readiness stage. And as you alluded to correctly, Linda, these consortiums come together frequently with people from different parts of the world. And we talk about consortia in a philosophical concept in a way that people come together and collaborate. But it's important to start to envision on the front end how you come together formally. Frequently what we find is there is an entity formed, that entity of some type, and it needs to be based somewhere. And based on who the stakeholders are, what your relationship is to the consortia, and where you're located, you may have a real strong point of view about what that entity form is, and also where it's located. Because to the extent that the consortia is popular and maybe there's some profits generated, you need a way to deal with those profits in a tax efficient manner. And so there's a lot of studying that goes on in terms of where that should be located and in what form. And, by the way, the founding members may expand later. Linda, you mentioned people coming and going later. While you may not be able to predict that, you should assume that it will change. The membership will change voluntarily or involuntarily for different reasons, and those people will be coming and going from different jurisdictions as well. And so being flexible, being mindful about how those things could change over time, a lot in the formation of the entity type. Good thinking there. Again, you can't predict everything, but you should just assume that flexibility is paramount. And having that jurisdictional lens on the front end from a legal entity form is critical.
So what I did here, you alluded to this being a little different than before, and what it sounds like you're talking about is gauging the extent to which you're reimagining some of the things you're doing as a business almost by joining these consortia. What I mean by that is this. What we've seen from consortia until now, and I heard mention of trade associations, for example, you'll see these roundtables. So until now, in the world of coopetition in some of these consortia, the aspect of trade associations has really been about, okay, we all have this common problem. We're all in the same industry. This isn't touching our core business. We're going to continue to engage our customers in this way and other businesses in this way. But we're going to use this trade association to kind of get the things that are away from our core business settled so that we have standards. But what we're seeing in a lot of the blockchain space is the coopetition aspect, the part that you guys are definitely leading in helping people understand and get their minds around it, does touch on those areas where the core business might change. So does that come up where you're meeting with some of these clients and they're saying, okay, we want to do this? Do you have to either caution them that they're going too far with their vision in the consortium? Do you say that there's a way to sort of bite off half and maybe more later? Or do you provide that kind of context and counsel? Do you walk them through, let's say, the important changes they're making on how these consortia come together and making the whole scope of consortia much larger than it has been before?
Oh, great.
So let me
go ahead, Linda, please.
Yeah. So let me start with a couple of foundational points. The first of which, let's just assume for a moment there is a consortium developed. In order to test, as you would even in an enterprise, forget the coopetition part, to test the new operating model, you want to identify something that is perhaps of high friction, but is of low competitive value, because you're testing the model of how the parties work together. But imagine moving to a much more, and you said, at the heart of the business, we are seeing blockchain solutions loaded with high value, high impact components of a business. and in this particular case, and I will draw it synonymous, for instance, to the payments industry, is the operating model strong enough to manage through the complexity of millions, billions, and maybe even trillions of dollars traversing the blockchain network in the category of something like settlements or trade finance? And I draw it synonymous to payments because the payments industry focuses on the resiliency of the system must work 9 to the 5 or 9 to the 7 nines. It can never be down. And so when we think about orchestrating a model across a multi-party coopetition, you may start with something as simplistic as testing the model, as I mentioned, high friction, low competitive value. But when you start to migrate into a lot of information of high value moving across the network, there has to be a high degree of orchestration and resilience brought about by both the operating model and the technology. Mike, you were going to say something as well.
Yeah, just very simply, you mentioned again earlier the trade associations and things like that. The trade associations are famous for giving cover, if you will, especially around things like regulatory statements. They group together participants to put in, one statement as a combined group, and there's strength in numbers. There's strength in numbers in consortia as well. But this goes even further. You're talking about transforming commerce and the way that assets are transferred over a technology solution like this. So this is bigger, and it comes with a lot more responsibility. There's a responsibility about. Go ahead. There's responsibility about funding and things. Please.
That's what I was trying to dig down to. Like, what's different about these consortia than in traditional ones? And you said it's a much more sophisticated relationship that you might be, let's say, turning, you're turning the consortia onto much greater responsibilities than, let's say, a press statement about we all agree or disagree about X or Y.
And that's it, exactly. I mean, we're talking about putting together a playground where no one's allowed to go home and take their ball and and leave the other players in the field, because that violates the original covenant of what you're getting into. There is a significant responsibility to joining a consortium. That responsibility could be funding put up front. It could be considerations and even concessions on IP ownership that you have to spread among the members. There have to be considerations of actually contributing staff and resources to the consortium. Very few consortia are actually led and built by third parties, and many of the consortia that are out there right now are relying very much on the responsibilities and the cooperation of the individual members to get FTE hours in there. And those have to be documented. Those have to be realized and agreed to up front, because if someone ends up being, as I always put it, a sponge rather than a contributor to something like this, there has to be some type of penalty for that. It may be a reduction in equity. It may be, an ouster from the consortium itself. So it brings in a whole new area of cooperation for this.
And I guess you would get into conversations about how easy it is. I mean, some of them could be easy to leave. Some could be difficult to leave, right? You've even got to, I think, go over those aspects where there isn't a one-size-fits-all for engagement in these entities that are being formed. Am I correct in this?
Yes, I would say you're correct in that. And Rob brought up a very, very good synopsis of this, in that not only do you have to think about the inevitable when someone may change their business, someone may get acquired, things like that, so there may be incoming and outgoing members, but very, very early on, you have to decide when you're going to go commercial with your consortia and how are you going to let future entrants play, right? So that's a big part of this, and something that needs to be considered very early on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So let's continue on this vein about what's different about these blockchain consortia. And I want to, I think we jumped over one important aspect, which is, I think it would be useful, and if one of you has, you do sit in a very bird's eye view type position at Deloitte. I think you do get to see a lot about what's going on in the world around this subject. So I would like to offer listeners, let's say, an overview of what the landscape in consortia experiments and live products look like in the industry today, and to really underline, what's going on out there. Where are we today in 2019 versus 2015, when a lot of these consortia started to announce themselves? And I think Linda might have the answer to this one.
Yeah, simply put, I mean, and Mike, you can layer onto this too, because you're a witness to this extensively. But if we look back 2015, dealing with a much different level of maturity, no question. And that's why I said at the very onset is looking at consortium strategy, the architecture, as well as the governance attributes, some of those things that Mike was just speaking about, was surely overlooked. It was oversimplified. It was viewed as, in some cases, just a simple extension of an existing, for instance, trade organization. And so, as we have mentioned, the attributes, whether it's things like the IP or onboarding or offboarding, or what's the implication is the follow through all the way of the financial statements. Those are very, very deep and important considerations. Notwithstanding, which was also discussed too, what is the economic model associated with this large consortium, including funding the future use cases that may need to be layered upon the existing network platform. Mike?
Sure, Linda, thank you. And I bet a vast percentage of the participants in today's call realize these are exciting times, and we're very fortunate to be talking about a technology today that doesn't tend to have a smooth growth curve. We tend to grow exponentially at times. So you're talking back to 2015. It's really not a long time ago, but boy, in blockchain time it sure is. And those early pioneers in consortia were really stepping out and taking a chance, right? So just think of all the different technology providers that have come to be. All the talk around regulation that we've had across the globe, regardless to even cryptocurrency and things like that, which are being discussed. But even the notion of blockchain itself was at one time a regulator's object of discussion. So we are getting more clarity every day as, to the direction that commerce is going via something like this. We're talking about new use cases like royalty payments, voting rights, settlements, as we said, confirmations, supply chain activities, food tracing, actually saving lives, the war against opioids in the pharma area. All these different things are now coming to light because those early pioneers back in 2015, all of 4 years ago, made some pretty bold steps and got us to where we are today.
And I suppose we've learned a lot, and that there's more than one pathway that can lead to success. There can be large ecosystem players coming together versus an industry body. So what are the benefits and challenges that each of these options bring in forming these consortia? So that would be, the question being, is it, I guess it's the difference between large horizontal groups that can make, across the supply chain, for example, or the vertical integration, or is it just one industry? Is there anything out of those different cocktails that you guys have noticed that have produced better results?
I guess I could maybe just start real quick. I'll be brief in deference to my other participants. So typically, you see this happening in a particular industry, but before you know it, there's other industries then coming in. And remember too that much of what's done in blockchain is agnostic of industry. One consortia's idea may be very applicable in another industry's pain points as well. So, but also one other thing that they do, remember these consortia, if they're forward-looking and inclusive, blockchain is the great disintermediator. There are also opportunities to actually bring those entities, they could be suppliers, vendors, that normally would be disintermediated with something like this, actually into the consortia itself. And I'll defer back to my other participants here for further comment.
Yeah, so I'll just add in, being an auditor and having a lot of audit clients, I will tell you that we see this across every single one of our industries, and people thinking about how could they be involved in the consortia, how could they impact, and really we're seeing a much different learning curve on what works, what doesn't work, what might work. But I will tell you that all are really considering blockchain and what that impact might be, and really thinking about thoughtfully what that impact may be, and thinking about how standard setters really are impacting what they're doing. And I'll chime in a little bit later here on what we're seeing on the audit side and some key considerations for that.
Great. So continuing on that vein, and my last question on the considering consortia part of our talk here is for you, Rob, and it's really around let's say a new organizing principle that seems to be surfacing around some of these consortia. And reconciling and settling transactions is an area where this technology can play a really important role. To that point, we have seen the concept of tokenization and stablecoins enter into the mix now with a lot of these consortia. And I know, Rob, that you're an expert in this, so I would like your perspective on what makes this appealing. Is this a trend that you see continuing, and why is this important in the considering stage?
Yep. No, thanks for that. And I'll say it's a very new industry, so experts may be a bit strong, but have been doing this a long time. And we've seen different tokenized business models inspired, by a controlled organization, and also those in more decentralized organizations. And as Linda alluded to in the beginning, consortia are not for everyone. It is one, popular avenue, particularly, I think, appealing to the larger, more mature state enterprises that want to come together. And one of the decisions they make, as you noted, is appropriately, hey, should we have a digital asset in play or not? And that digital asset, and I use that word broadly just because I think, the references to cryptocurrencies and tokens and stablecoins, I think those get confused. And the type of asset that is either designed by the consortium or used by the consortium is very relevant. And that's because of securities laws and money transmission, and in particular tax. And these have tax impacts as they're used in the consortium. To get tactical, if you form the legal entity, which is the consortium, and it's used as part of the business, it's not uncommon for the usage of those digital assets, not only in producing normal revenue generating activities, but also volatility associated with the digital asset, triggering gain and loss, attributing that gain or loss to the members of a consortium, even without associated distributions of the funds to maybe pay the tax associated. And the rules are very wildly. We're very early in the regulatory framework globally associated with how do you think about digital assets and the taxation of them. And so this gets to, as members come together, understanding what is the risk tolerance of each member coming together, and how are they going to seek clarity on the rules before before we have guidance, before I guess as the world evolves in this emerging new state of commerce. Some consortium are being very formal and methodical and going after private letter rulings in certain jurisdictions to claim clarity and to gain clarity where they might otherwise have it. Others are just studying it and gaining a point of view and a level of comfort that everybody can live with. But to your point, using stable coins as a means of exchange, sometimes creating their own asset to enable the new levels of commerce they're creating, sometimes joining forces with another industry player and actually inviting them into a member of the consortium. We've seen digital assets emerge in virtually every industry out there around the world, and so looking to join forces with sort of a best-in-class protocol or platform or decentralized application that the consortium may use. So big consideration. It's pretty wild, but definitely an unlock to some of the newly innovative business concepts out there, but pretty sophisticated in terms of tax considerations.
And we are seeing, some pretty interesting deployments in general around this stuff. So there's definitely headway being made.
Maybe just to hit on one further key consideration to think about as you're forming a consortium or joining a consortium. I think it might be a good time now to just hit on, a key thing that people need to think about way ahead of time, and that is, when you think about how the blockchain works, you need to think about how third parties will be relying on the blockchain. Will it be financial reporting related, or will it be operational? There's a couple key things you have to ask yourself in that, and that is, number one, have you thought about your audit ramifications, and number two, have you thought about the internal control ramifications? I think those things often go overlooked as you get down the road, and those are two key things that really are critical to be building early on. So when you think about internal controls, you have considerations around cybersecurity, you have controls around provisioning for access to write a blockchain, a lot of different things you need to make sure that are well thought out and documented and implemented before you actually execute. And then as it relates to the audit, you really need to think about auditability. That's a word we use a lot, especially when you get into digital assets. But you really need to think about how is that information being used, how is it impacting financial reporting, and ultimately how will your auditor be able to get evidence for certain types of transactions or the physical movement or control when you're thinking about that. So it's something that's very critical for everyone to think about, the consortium members to think about. And really, there's also a lot of accounting-specific issues that are very unique that we're dealing with. Again, maybe more so on the digital asset space, but a lot of accounting ramifications that might be new and emerging that have to be thought through very carefully as you're going down this path. So you keep yourself within the guardrails here as you go along.
Really interesting and neat to see that there are certainly pitfalls, but we're definitely paving the road for this to be a much more off-the-shelf experience for some groups. So that's the good news, despite it being complicated. But of course, the complexity never ends. And building a consortia, sort of the second part of this conversation, it's one thing, I suppose, to put all of your problems on a table, say we can solve this, and really start ideating on a best case scenario. And a lot of the blockchain industry is still really much in this sort of ideation and imagination phase where things are being imagined as a solution to this and that, and then it's got to get tested. That's the big thing that I suppose is so different with this technology. Technology until now could have shipped as a beta. You can ship a video game as a beta product. But of course, what you guys are talking about are real business functions and customer relationships and business relationships. And these things are not easily shipped in beta. They have to either be perfect and bulletproof or you shouldn't do it. So when you actually go from thinking about it to building it, then things change. Things become a lot more critical. So forming these has a range of really practical implications. You're forming something, you're producing something. And so a lot of tactical thinking has to go into that. The one that jumps out to me right away is counsel. So what kind of advice do you guys provide on that? And how important is that when actually building and moving beyond the ideation stage?
So this is Linda. I'll take that as a place to start. Specifically regarding counsel, as I mentioned again at the onset, that the consortium model is often overlooked and oversimplified. The beginning is the best place to begin to leverage counsel, whether it's startup or leveraging internal counsel if it's enterprise. The reality is setting the right guardrails at the beginning allows for a higher degree of impact and success as you begin to not just onboard the first set of blockchain transactions, but those that will come further down the road. And so the value of counsel is essential. essentially, when we talk about setting up an operating model amongst a consortium, fundamentally it's almost a legal operating structure, a legal entity structure. And so that becomes a very important and critical element of this. In fact, Rob, maybe you can opine a little bit further, given your direct experience in working with counsel on some of these models, particularly for startups.
Yeah, we found that the iteration, particularly in the design phase, is important to have a bunch of different lenses in the room, particularly with counsel representing securities laws and corporate laws. In designing the transaction flows, there's dependencies between those types of rules in the regulatory environment and tax, as well as KYC, AML sort of considerations. And it's interesting in the ideation phase of these consortiums, and as you alluded to, other startups we see in this space, you see them going down and shifting paths very quickly. And so it's important to have the right people in the room as you ideate to note the dependencies. There may be an idea that draws a lot of excitement from the business side and maybe the attorneys, but then it blows up something on the tax front. And so it's important to self-correct early rather than going too far down the path and then checking in later. So while sometimes that means there's a lot of people in the room at one time, if you can foster a collaborative environment collectively in a more robust ideation session, while it's a lot of people, it tends to add a bit more grace, I think, through the ideation, and you can start to bookmark and recognize the dependencies between the different rules and considerations early on. We've seen, again, if management, if the leadership team can set a good tone of collaboration, checking your egos at the door, and really everybody working together and respecting each other's points of view, you can usually ideate with much more efficiency and grace.
And I suppose doing everything right at those early junctures really allows you to check progress as you move a lot better, because a lot of these participants certainly have different incentives and objectives when they're joining a coopetition type environment and building something out of coming together with your own competitors. So checking your egos at the door, I imagine, is really important, because if it wasn't that, you would have these things perhaps grow in a healthy way to favor one party and their incentives and objectives. But how do you track progress when these are being built, and how do you navigate the decision-making process of a consortium to make sure that it is growing in a healthy way and not maybe to one member or in a way that doesn't serve everybody?
So this is Mike. I think one of the best gauges for watching how a consortium grows and its success as it continues is the fact that it stays together over time. Rob brought up some great, and Linda too, some great points about counsel. One of the things folks need to not check at the door when they come into something like this is their own business strategy. Every firm that these consortia are made up of have a 5-year, 10-year, or longer business strategy. And they have to make sure that that's considered, although, kept to themselves, of course, but considered when you're joining something like this. This has to be an attribute to that strategy. Perhaps, again, it's getting rid of that commercial stickiness and things like that. That can once again, shorten the life of a consortium if you're not making those full considerations. Even just, long-term strategy about proliferation of the platform, perhaps something like going outside of the single geography that it was originally created in and going to different economic areas of the world. Those things have to be considered, but they also have to be given a very clear and concise timeline. It's very much, for those that are on the call that are project managers, you'll know this, agile but very well thought out project plans have to be devised as these entities are coming together. And again, it comes down to that point made earlier about those individual expectations of the firms that are partners in these consortiums, but also the consortium itself. There has to be expectations on the success of the group, and if for some reason it's floundering, It's one of those hard discussions that probably the group needs to come together and talk about is to, are we really on the right commercial path, and do we need to change or maybe just start something new? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I've heard, and it's expected, being Deloitte, you have a lot of professional competencies within your organization. But there's one aspect in particular that we haven't discussed, and I'm certain CoinDesk readers and listeners would be very curious, and that revolves around the technology, because of course there's often a platform that is developed, so building the tech. So what do stakeholders from the organization need to be involved in with respect to the design and the operations of the consortium and actually deploying that piece of technology? What are the trends that you guys have seen in there? Is it really a lot of, let's say, white labeling and, let's say, forking a lot of the public software that's out there? Is there a lot of bespoke stuff going on? What do you guys see in that, and what do you guys counsel in that aspect?
There's a few things. And Mike, you can opine from an industry perspective would be terrific. I think we see, particularly you go back to 2015, I think we see early stage where there were a lot of private blockchains being built. They were perhaps consortium and membership that were smaller. You mentioned the forking of the actual public chains. So I think we are seeing a progress towards what will also help is standardization. There's a lot of discussion around protocols and standards, and that the consistency that we create through not creating a single standard that would not be realistic. This is a very open architecture by its very nature, and so it's important that there is a diversity in terms of the actual structure itself and the standards itself. But I think that we see over time that, from the technology perspective, that this element of standards, the resiliency, as I mentioned early on, is absolutely essential because of the flow and the volume of business impacting transactions that are riding on these platforms is essential. Mike, maybe you can elaborate as well from some of your domain expertise within the energy industry.
Sure, no, absolutely. And if all will forgive me for a moment of shameless self-promotion. So one thing to know about this, and this helps everyone understand how Deloitte plays a role in this. But Deloitte, when it comes to consortia, we can strategize to create one, we can build the platform itself, and we can manage it on an ongoing basis. Now, I will say that depending on the commercial value that is trying to be achieved through the consortia, that may not be the best decision. Because, as we talked about before, the exponential developments that are happening in blockchain every day, with new technologies, trial and error that's going on all the time, things being tried and successfully or unsuccessfully that are being applied to different industries and things. This is a very quickly changing ecosystem that we're living in. So all things need to be considered as to the best route. So many times you can see a consortium made up of some of the largest companies in a business line, and yet use a brand new startup technology provider because they've figured out that one widget that really is going to bring value. It may be reading certain types of IoT sensors or something like that. So I think that's the biggest consideration when you're looking at the technology itself, but then also, of course, the environment that technology will reside in, whether it's Ethereum or whatever it might be that you look at to go forward. Again, looking at your business case. These are all very important considerations, again, to do early on. You would not want to change course later on. That could be very expensive and maybe be the end of the consortium itself. So something definitely to consider early.
And on that level, I suppose you would be testing the robustness of the platform with these folks, testing who can see what data, who verifies transaction, who plays what role in the actual deployment of the technology. And so those are all things that you guys consult with these groups on, if I'm not misunderstanding.
You're correct. Ideation, proof of concept, pilot to scalable platform. Correct.
Well,
and Nolan, let's be clear too that the various levels, if we go very deeply into the technology components, the infrastructure layer, which is largely our cloud providers, there's a lot of consistency there and the ability to connect through into the cloud as the infrastructure layer. The data layer remains the same, which is really where's the insights going to be driven, whether it's on-chain or off-chain data. So nothing exponentially complicated there. Important, but remember, it's the blockchain layer that we're settling into, and that becomes a very important component of this. So I think when we look at back to your question around the technology, I think sometimes there's a lot of discussion that overcomplicates what blockchain really is. But to be clear, the UI layer, the application layer, the data layer, the blockchain layer, the infrastructure layer, there's a lot of consistency which exists around large scale enterprise, high transaction volumes that exist that are early prior to the blockchain era.
Well, and that understanding all of those aspects and how these things are, understanding the robustness of the platforms, and let's say the record they have already. They've been deployed. They're not founded a few months ago now. It's a few years ago. So we're actually seeing some of this stuff going live. We're seeing these consortia execute on commercial transactions with multiple parties involved. So we've seen it, and the hurdle that you guys are faced with, if I'm not mistaken, is that your customers, when they turn the switch, whatever it is that's been built, whatever group that's come together and platform that's been built, must scale immediately, or will scale immediately. They wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't going to satisfy the business needs automatically. So what happens, when you're about to flip that switch? What do you need to go through with some of your partners to get them to the point where this thing is live and executed?
I'm gonna start, and then maybe I'll hand it over to my colleagues in a second. But one of the things, just hinging off the technology discussion that just happened, it's important to think about. And there were references to some protocols which may be open source and some which are designed specifically for the consortium. And the concept of, even in an open source environment, is there intellectual property somewhere? Whose is it? Where is it? And particularly in a consortium, it gets a little clunky because you need to decide early on and be ready before you flip the switch, as you noted, deciding which of the IP, technology or broader IP, is ours, shared, versus mine, versus yours, right? And understanding what that is, because once you flip the switch, it will be used. And there will be value attributable to that intellectual property, and people using that intellectual property, both members within the consortium and stakeholders which are using the system that you just designed. And so knowing what that is on the front end, because as you've appropriately said, people in a consortium, they're usually more mature state enterprises, and when you flip the switch, they're scaling day one. They're scaled, basically, so that you've seen value attribution, and you need to be ready to deal with where that IP is used and making sure that all parties are remunerated correctly for that intellectual property. So heavy transfer pricing lens and considerations on that.
Yeah, that's right, Rob. And the other thing from a technology standpoint, too, is exhaustive testing, and that obviously should be in the plan of any type of implementation and consortium work like this. So it's important to think about what it is you're trying to improve upon in a business transaction ecosystem, but also what can break, right? So a far-reaching consortium where you have commerce and transfer of value and assets transferring between counterparties and things like that is a great way to move something like this forward. But it can also break other processes. You've got to be ready to look at things like your SAP system internally, your deal capture system if you so have one, your SOX reporting and things. So many different things that depend upon what has been a business structure in place for many, many years is now transforming. And a lot of other technologies have to transform along with it. So that would be the one thing that I would give listeners today. Test before you launch.
Yeah, I don't think that would be poor advice. As I mentioned earlier, this is not a video game, and it better work when it goes out the door, because there's no do-overs, I don't think.
Yeah, we can't respawn in this one.
So you guys have been doing this for a few years now, and I'm gonna appeal again to this bird's eye view for an important sort of large scale question around executing on consortia. And I'm wondering, really, is there a particular industry or sector that's ripe for this disruption? And where do you see this technology in the near term having its greatest impact? So Rob, why don't you get started on that one?
Thanks. Hand it to the tax guy.
Just because I think coins are part of it.
That's right. No, it's interesting, and we've really watched this cut across many industries for a long time, in areas that you wouldn't otherwise predict it. But I think to answer your question specifically, where there are industry players that have to come together to collaborate in some fashion where there's overlap, things like supply chain scenarios where we're getting multiple parties together, where there's handoffs between a lot of unrelated parties through a transaction flow, where they're all incentivized to move along a transaction flow, make it faster, make it tighter, make it more transparent, bring the real value of a blockchain solution to play. I think that's where we're seeing the most of it. But again, hard, because everybody's got different skin in the game. Some are mature state players, some a little more nascent state. So difficult, but I think that tends to be the biggest prize out there, is in the really robust supply chain space. That's just from my perspective.
And that's where you see in the nearest term there'll be an impact.
I would say the nearest term, because I think it's a hard solve, but I think that is that is definitely an area ripe for some massive consortium opportunity. Yeah.
And Brian, what about you?
Yeah, I agree with Rob. I think we see it a lot in supply chain. I think from an industry perspective, life sciences is an area we have many conversations, and our consumer practice is another one where we're spending a lot of time with this.
IoT still seems like an obvious fit. Is there a lot going on in that space?
IoT is. Go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, I can chime in quick on energy since Linda pointed out my focus areas. I'm down here coming to you from Houston today, so certainly. The transport of product across pipelines, on trucks, the storage tank availability, all the different things around an energy supply chain like that. But it goes even further. You're talking about the ability to trace electrons across wires and through meters and things when it comes to electricity. And of course, IoT sensors can look at things like quality. There's a number of great things being done out of MIT and other places around IoT tech that are happening. Linda, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think you ask a very pointed question, and the reality is first of all, blockchain exists better in cooperation with things like IoT. We think about the elements around, Mike was just talking about energy. We think about other supply chain types of activities. But it is happening across both for-profit and non-profit type businesses. You see this for the social good. There is a substantial amount of work being done around blockchain, around social good, and whether, by way of example, funding is landing in the right hands because of traceability with blockchain and other provenance types of attributes. But across the industries, healthcare, life sciences, energy, as Rob talks about supply chain, we see that not just things being incubated, but things being launched truly into production, maybe not fully at scale, but we see, given the broad nature of our global practice, depending upon geographies too, a higher propensity for maybe work being done in the Asia-Pac region around financial services versus in more regulatory conservative environments like the U.S., where maybe less so. So I think as all of us who are participating even on this call would venture to say, it is quite vast. But when you start to combine it with things like AI and IoT and other technologies that help you advance and accelerate the prospect, remember, I shared the layers of the technology. The new layer is the blockchain protocols. There is a substantial reorganize an operating model of vertically or horizontally within or across industry to take advantage of whether it's operational savings, whether it's transparency, with the ultimate pursuit of what is the Internet of Value, which is the foundation of what blockchain is built.
And Nolan, we'd probably be remiss if we didn't talk about payments and fintech and financial services. We're obviously seeing a lot there. And it's been going on for a while, all segments of financial services with clear incentives for people to collaborate there. A lot of innovation, moving quickly. So, it's a good area and a lot
definitely being driven by live activity. That's not a lot of that is still in the bottle. That seems to be out in the wild as it is, and it's certainly moving along. So I want to finish this webinar, I think, with an important piece of information for listeners. Once again, this is a major part of a major business in the world, and I think that our listeners would benefit greatly from hearing one succinct piece of advice on how an organization who's looking to partake in a consortium should consider. So one piece of advice from each of you, and that will bring us to the end of this webinar. So Linda, let's have you first.
Sure. My encouragement to the audience is think big, think broader in terms of all of the operating components, whether it's business impact, assurance, tax, risk and compliance, governance, implementation, orientation. These are very important considerations as you think about co-opetition. Do not trivialize the complexity of working out the elements of the business model.
Excellent. So bring a serious mind and think big. And not think big, definitely have a wide gaze on what could go wrong and be prudent but serious. Rob, what about you?
Yeah, I think I would just caution everybody with digital assets really becoming more popular. Just remember, not all digital assets are created equal, and again, the terminology is I think getting confused a lot. Even you referenced stablecoin a while ago. Even a stablecoin, that term, we see stablecoins designed by algorithm. Some are fiat backed, some are backed by a basket of assets or a specific asset class like a commodity. Some being referenced as digital representation of a precious metal. So
some just are a lot psychological.
Right, some are psychological, right? So I think it's just an important consideration as they're always at the table. They may not be used, but as they're at the table, just making sure that everybody's kept honest and the different regulatory lenses of each.
Terrific. Brian.
Yeah, I would say early involvement of others in thinking through all this is really critical. I'll go back to making sure you really know what the end game is on how people will be using what you've created. Where is it going? What is it impacting financial reporting? You need to think about all those things because there are a lot of complexities in there related to what regulators are involved, how it will ultimately be reported, what your auditors need, all those things. There's a lot of people that are very smart to help you navigate all that to get to the right place where you don't have to recreate things at the end. So early involvement critical.
Great, thanks. And Mike, cleanup hitter.
Appreciate that. corporate clarity, I would say that. So what that means is, again, enter something like a consortium with clear thought and understanding of your overall personal corporate strategy. We're all guilty of, at times, chasing shiny objects in blockchain. I know everyone on the phone is. So do go in with open eyes and open mind.
Well, thanks a lot, guys. We're up against the hour here. Thanks for taking the time and joining us, listeners. I appreciate it a great deal. CoinDesk appreciates it, and I'm sure Deloitte appreciates it. Thanks so much to the Deloitte speakers for joining us today, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks so much.
Bye.